Hello, and welcome to the Pan-Africanist, Amani-Africa's podcast on multilateral policy process of concern and interest for Africa and on the African Union. The African Union theme of the year for 2025 is Justice for Africans and African people of African descent through reparations. While this theme is not completely new to the Organization of African Unity or African Union, it's not fully understood. There are many questions. What is this theme about and what is it not about? How did the African Union get to this theme? Why and how does this theme of the year matter? Not just for Africa, but for the wider global system. To discuss these and other issues with me, I have the pleasure of being joined by Brian Kagoro. Brian is a Pan-Africanist and a global development practitioner who is director at the Open Society Foundations. He has been following this theme for a number of years, including in the lead up to the adoption of this theme as the theme of the year of the African Union by the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union. Welcome.
This is not the first time that the AU are engaging this subject.
The subject, yes. They've done so 11 times before.
And so, I mean, the fact that they have been doing this, including during the time of the Organization of African Unity, obviously raises questions. One of the questions is, what is new? And what has been, how did we get to this point as well in terms of the journey that has been traveled both intellectually but also politically in order for having this theme designated as the theme of the year? And what is the significance of the designation of this theme as the theme of the year for the subject matter itself?
Yeah, so maybe let me, if you allow me, let me give a little bit of the history of Africa's engagement with it.
Please.
So Nkrumah, as early as 1962, 61, 62, was talking about this subject, as were, I think, two other people, Sekou Touré, and across the diaspora, it was the Maroons in Jamaica. So the Rastafarian movement has been consistent on this matter. It had been a subject as a small accent in the civil rights movement in the United States, but a subject also in the struggles in the Caribbean for independence. But in Africa, in December 1990, there was a first World Conference on Reparations at the Nigeria Institute of International Affairs, NIA. And then the 27th African Union Assembly of Heads of States and Government, and the 55th Council of Ministers in June 1991 had a reparations resolution. And then the 28th summit of the OAU Head of State and Government appointed a group of eminent persons at its summit in Dakar, Senegal. So this was in June 1992. These eminent persons are interesting when you think about it. There was Professor Samir Amin of Egypt. There was Jackie from Dr. Onasan Jackie from Ghana, Madame Gracia Machel from Mozambique, Ambassador Doodle Thompson of Jamaica, Congressman Roland Dulums from the US, MKO Abiola from Nigeria, Professor Ade Ajay from Nigeria, Miss Miriam Makeba of South Africa, Professor Ali Mazrui of Kenya, Aristide Pereira from Cape Verde, Professor Rex Natal Ford from Jamaica, amongst others. And then in 1993, you had the first Pan-African conference on reparations in Abuja. And then in 2004, there was an attempt to do the Africa Reparations Act. And this had also been taken up at the 1994 Pan-African Congress as part of the resolution of the Kampala Congress, the seventh PAC. But in 1999, you had the Accra Declaration on reparations. In 2000, then the Durban Racism Conference happened, and the reparations agenda was torpedoed. In 2008, civil society groups gathered again in Accra, had a declaration. 2013, during the occasion, as you will recall, in Addis, of the AU 50th anniversary, the communique in Addis referenced this issue of reparations. Then you had a civil society gathering in 2022 that Mahmoud Kamara and a couple of other people put together. That is the Accra Declaration. And in 2023, the Ghanaian government hosted this Global Reparations Summit, where there was a declaration. And let me, having given that, it's useful for me to anchor your question as to what was the conversation about, because you are seeing 12 efforts concentrated at certain times, then they dissipate. It was thinking about repairing dignity, repairing development, addressing global inequalities, injustices, exclusion, and the erasure of Black histories, of Black lives. And then there was also the issue of representation, leadership required of the Afros, descended and African peoples in global processes. And the concern was on base building, building the base for reparations, case building, which is building the case for reparations, pace building, building the momentum for reparations. And what seemed clear was that depending on where one sits contextually, and the context of evolution of a country, of the liberation process, some people were asking for monetary compensation. Some people were asking for other forms of redress, satisfaction. They were asking for memorialization. They were asking for restitution of cultural assets that had been looted, restitution of land that had been taken. So you saw the land restitution claims in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Mozambique, across the whole continent. So what the basis I wanted to establish is that the claims, notion, jurisprudence, thinking of repair inheres in most African pre-colonial cultural, customary, and legal systems. And I have referenced the written Monday Charter of 1225. Now, let's fast forward.
Just before you proceed there, because the question, the conceptual issue is not simply about the passage of time, right? The passage of time is one of the issues that it raised. But from the perspective of time, one of the questions for people of African descent and people of Africa is basically, have those events really lapsed? Have they really passed? In the sense that, are they not related to the conditions of life of people today? Whether we talk about enslavement from the transatlantic trade in African human beings, or colonialism, that
Or
the
apartheid,
consequences,
yeah.
or apartheid, the consequences and the impact thereof continues to define the living conditions and the life opportunities of people to this day. And therefore, the idea that this is something of the past and therefore has nothing to do with, and can't be claimed on the basis of, today's, legal standards. How do you see that?
Yeah, so there are three separate legal and sociological and political considerations. In Western law, if one were to accept it, theft is a continuous crime, which means it doesn't matter when you steal, right? As long you can still run for 100 years. When we catch up with you, that crime won't have expired. Time does not expunge liability and accountability for theft. So if you accept that there was looting, or let's use the word theft, of cultural heritage, of gold, of wealth that belonged to countries that are now characterized as donor or aid dependent countries, right? Now, let me link it to your point. This theft did not end with a once-off event during the chattelized enslavement of Africans, right? It continued into colonialism. It continued into apartheid. It continued to the present day. So some of the disputes that have arisen in the Sahel between France and her former colonies is this idea that not only did France benefit from looting Haiti and then imposing a system of illegal extraction of benefit that impoverished Haiti. What we have, my brother, is that many countries were locked in, especially in the French-speaking West Africa, locked into agreements under force, right, to hand over rather fraudulently their wealth. Right? So it is not only a crime during chattel enslavement. These activities continued during colonialism, during the Cold War, under the guise of fighting against communism or something. People would come and loot, cause insecurity in a country, and etc. The fraudulent activities that created perpetual dependency to enable ransacking of economies, right? It continues to this day. But the ecological overreach, that you come and you use unsustainable mining methods, including the dumping of toxic chemicals and waste, and where it is the mining of oil and gas, you allow unsustainable and toxic levels of emissions into the air. So where the refinery of Engen is in Durban, for example, within a radius of 10 kilometers, many of the children who were born after the establishment of the refinery suffer from respiratory diseases. And the same story amongst the Ogoni people and elsewhere, where when we poison underground water, when we poison the soil, the cattle, the soil fertility, the water becomes a source of disease and inflammation. The widespread inability to sustainably produce food on that soil as a result of it's been spoiled, it has not been conserved, also means the following: unreliable water sources, unreliable agricultural capacities and possibilities. That means food insecurity. We were evicting whole villages, or at least the colonial enterprise, whole villages, whole people, to establish mines with very little backward, forward, sideward linkage to the national economy, let alone the social indices in a particular area. So you are right. Whether it's the climate impact or the health impact, the socio-economic determinants of insecurity in most of Africa can be linked to these historical factors. Now, this is not to say that our own post-colonial, or rather should we call it independence leadership, have not been culpable of contributing to. But at law, there is always, I cannot say, well, there was a reckless driver who rammed into a bus. The bus overturned. The driver, after the bus had overturned, ran away. And some thieves came and stole watches from the passengers who were wounded. That the only people who should be prosecuted are the wounded, watch thieves. Let's forget about the driver who has caused loss of limb, loss of life, and etc. There's a farcical reasoning sometimes when we come to discussing accountability. There are things for which the African leadership and Africans take responsibility for. But the idea that we should expunge historical accountability and memory of atrocity that has continuing effects to this day is an idea that's not been acceptable in any Western nation, that's not acceptable in any Arab nation, that's not acceptable in any Latin American or let alone African nation. That history determines the continuities of the present and shapes how we arrive into the future. The struggle for reparations is not a nostalgic reflection on pains of our ancestors. It is a reflection on the reality of our underdevelopment, as Walter Rodney said, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. How we can write the story about how parts of the world, historically, through colonialism, chattel enslavement, look, the wealth of the West. Let's talk about King Leopold's Congo, right? How does the Belgian king construct his wealth? By amputating, treating in the most inhuman and cruel way locals, forcing them into labor in order to produce the quotas needed to enrich his economy. The descendants of the amputees, the descendants and owners of the land around which he established his mines through his companies are still alive today. Now, let me not end it there. As late as 1955, Dr. Deso, there were Congolese and other Africans who were kept in human zoos. For those who listen to this podcast, let me explain what that is. They'll take human beings from Africa, put them in a cage in the midst of winter in Europe, as you now do monkeys and other animals. And white folk could come and see these human beings in cages, right? Those who dared to resist were hung publicly, their heads decapitated. Those heads were taken to the British Museum and elsewhere in Europe, and they were kept as trophies. And you know our traditional belief systems about the resting of the dead. So when we're talking about repair, we're talking about actions that will return the human remains, that will return the stolen wealth, that will return the dignity, but actions that will acknowledge the inhumanity of the other. Denialism that having built a few roads and a few railway lines in order to take our gold to the coast, our manganese, our copper to the coast, offsets the levels of cruelty. There were no starving Africans in what was then called Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe when the pioneer column arrived. When they arrived, they imposed a tax system, taxation. So that's another dimension of reparations. The colonial system that claims to have bettered our people imposed the tax system forcibly. It was called hard tax. That means every individual household had to pay a tax that enabled the luxurious lives of the colonialists, because they did not come from England holding the wealth that they needed to live the lavish lifestyles that they lived. They grabbed land, they grabbed gold, ivory, and etc. So the dispossession is one element, and the enforced conscription into an economic system that guaranteed the comfort and wealth of people who arrived on this continent with very little or nothing becomes part of that story. We now find ourselves where we all have to live together, because you are not going in the acknowledgement is repair. Apology is repair. Memorialization is repair. Compensation is repair. Restitution is repair.
Now, what you have described clearly indicates that there has to be a very systematic methodology of going about pursuing this agenda in order to achieve the objectives. Given that there have been a dozen previous efforts, at least within the framework of the OAU, that arose at different points in time and then dissipated, as you put it. What needs to happen now, and how differently should this agenda be pursued in this particular context that we are in?
So what can be done, Solomon? Number one, you need political consciousness amongst Africans. Their outrage and irritation towards their governments should not create stupidity or foolishness that absorbs the empire, that absorbs the geo-economic and geopolitical factors and actors that are undermining the very sovereignty of Africa today and the futures of their children. I think sometimes ignorance makes you think that all your problems are local, and dishonesty makes you say all your problems are external. It is the balance, and nuanced political consciousness is understanding that balance. So consciousness, education, and information. Number two, organization, organizing, mobilization. Africans are very active when we organize around the war in Gaza, right? They are even more fair attuned to the United States election, more involved, more passionate, more, or even matters to do with the British royal family. They're not as engaged on issues that are of existential importance to them. And I'm not talking about Africans in the village. I'm talking about literate Africans who have almost accepted that their role is proximity to the empire, acceptability within Western centers, and not necessarily the liberation and development of their own people. So I do not care really where one works and who one works for. I suppose what people I am saying here is it doesn't matter whether you are at the World Bank, you are in a philanthropy such as I am, you work for Coca-Cola, or you work for yourself. There must be a collective consciousness. The same way when we have a family issue at home, it really doesn't matter where you have come from. You understand what is the imperative for the family. And Africa is a collective, as diverse as we are, as fragmented as we may be, as heterogeneous as we are. This is a family issue that if we are, it doesn't matter whether you look light or you look very dark, you are tall or you are very short. If we're collectively disrespected in the global economy, invisibilized in global economy, if we're collectively treated with disrespect in global security, within spaces of the global financial architecture and in debates about the global development financing, if we are treated with contempt in conversation about global climate justice and climate transformation, loss and damage, repair, whatever you call it. It really doesn't matter whether your country is getting a little bit more investment than the one next door. What matters is we are not respected. And we will not redeem respect from others that we don't give to ourselves. So repair, finally, Solomon, for me, is about healing from the things we have done to ourselves and to each other. The fact that we have allowed ourselves to be so disconnected from the African Americans, so disconnected from the Afro-Caribbeans, so disconnected from Black people in Brazil and elsewhere, and have not, through the African Union, moved beyond rhetorical commitment to the sixth region, to practical programs around economic integration and inclusion, political repair. If something happens to the Black community in Latin America, surely, if it's the sixth region, the African Union and African leaders must pronounce themselves. We've paid a blind eye when African migrants are ill-treated in Europe. No European country has ever received any censure from the African Union for ill-treating African migrants. In fact, the whimpers that we had when there was ill treatment of Black students at the beginning of the war in Ukraine were rare, but also sheepish. The assertiveness that you accept, it almost, we don't value citizens when they are within our countries. We don't value them when they go out as a result of the push factors that comes from our own mistakes. So repair from what we have done to ourselves, repair from what others have done to us, must be a concurrent conversation. And this is why you said it needs a methodology. I think first it needs that consciousness. I think it also needs, I think that researchers, writers, and co should tell us not only what has happened, but should also get us to understand that this is not an American struggle. This is not just a Caribbean struggle. This is a universal struggle of all people of African descent. And that to me is the essence of why this is not just a state-centric push. This is people to people finding each other, not only sharing in our pain, but sharing in our vision of a world that will never treat our grandchildren and our children the same way it treated us or treated our grandparents.
The role that the African Union needs to have in terms of, appreciating and valuing and respecting the life of Africans, and how we as Africans also treat ourselves and view ourselves in terms of that, according that human dignity to the lives of African and people of African descent. The connection that is established between Africa and people, that needs to be done. Clearly, there are different layers, but also different pathways for achieving this thing. I think this articulation, of course, clarifies a lot of issues, that we are not concerned only with one aspect of big issues, but in its entirety. Are the global issue that it is. You made a point, about the problems from our side. There are, confusions and uncertainties about whether or not this is about, for example, I heard in conversations here in Addis, whether this is about, for example, the transitional justice policy of the African Union. And I was like, but that one actually articulates principles and standards that need to be followed and pursued when certain events happen in a particular country, in a particular society within Africa, in respect to how to go about overcoming the wrongs that happened in the course of certain events and certain period in time. Of course, it acknowledges the historical dimension of things, but it's not meant to be actually the platform for pursuing reparatory justice for people of Africa and African descent vis-a-vis those historical injustices that made reference. That is one sort of thing that needs to be clarified. The other one is you made reference to, the concern or anxiety on the part of the diplomats that this may end up affecting or undermining or compromising our trading relationship or our aid development, or creates uncomfortable, situation in our engagement with our partners. What is your response to these concerns?
Let me start with the transitional justice. You and I, transitional justice addresses the dimension of what we have done to ourselves, healing from what we have done to ourselves, using our own cultures, using our own national and local customary laws to arrive at what? Conciliation, reconciliation, to arrive at truth, at justice, to arrive at social cohesion, to build the social capital for a human rights-based development, the social capital for an inclusive development base. So transitional justice is our promissory note that following periods of massive human rights violations, mass atrocity, or crisis, where all sorts of violations, harm is done, we allow ourselves in the true dialogic African tradition to introspect. And in introspecting, we allow ourselves to assign a responsibility and accountability. And in doing so, we keep in mind our desire to build our community into a cohesive and prosperous Africa. So transitional justice does not address what others who have come from outside have done and continue to do. But in transitional justice are certain indicators that we need to keep in mind. Number one, that harm has continuous psychological, environmental, political, institutional, and leadership that, as Nomfundo Mohapi from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation once said, wounded leaders produce wounded, right? And wounded societies produce wounded leaders. And woundedness is the basis upon which collective violence has festered in our society. People live in perpetual desire to exact vengeance or revenge upon each other on the basis of identity or historical grievance. So the transitional justice process is not a victor's justice framework. It is a process that says none of us can truly win, and our nations cannot be saved by a Stone Age mentality that depends on who has the biggest stick or the biggest stone. But in the true Ubuntu, Utu, human, whatever we call it across different parts of Africa, I am because you are. I humanize you by acknowledging your pain. I humanize you by acknowledging your potential. I humanize you by acknowledging your role, your participation, your contribution. It's building that framework that answers, amongst other things, the national question, and realizes that when we build states without building the national consciousness of a sense of belonging, of being and becoming, and that social, if you like, compact that we want to live together as one people, even if we belong to different religious, different ethnic and other groups. Now, and in transitional justice, whether it's in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation or processes that we've seen elsewhere, centerpiece, no one ever claims that let bygones be bygones, because in African tradition, truth may not necessarily heal, but truth serves as an assurance that you recognize your contribution to my condition. Now, the mechanisms of transitional justice cannot address the egregious violations of King Leopold, because King Leopold is not subject to African transitional justice framework. If you take the continental policy, it applies to continental entities. If you take the national frameworks, they apply to national actors. The reparative justice framework globalizes by saying, no, even if we made up, healed from our intercommunal wars, some of the violations that were caused by our own dictators, whether it's Maputo, Banda, and etc., we would still not have recovered or addressed the structural continuities, economic structural factors that did predetermine our underdevelopment that were authored by the chattelized enslavement of Africans, colonialism, apartheid. The struggle for reparations says, let's deal with the question of African prosperity not as an abstract increase in the volume of trade, but enabling people to re-own what belongs to them. Or if they can't totally re-own it, to have a share of what belongs to them. No European, no American would accept if today we went and we took over portions of Wolverhampton, we took over portions of Liverpool and Manchester, and took over. And then we say to them, let bygones be bygones. We have taken over your entities. And maybe when we take them over, we put African colors there. They look a little bit more colorful, more African. We bring some vibe there. And then we say, we've improved it. And because we've improved it, your children must work for us in perpetuity. Then we erase all the founders. We go to Liverpool Football Club and Manchester United. We take away all the pictures of the people who founded the clubs, and we put the Deso, the Dea, the Kagoros. And we say, no, forget all this erasure, which was deliberate to create the impression that you white folk of Manchester, Liverpool, and etc., through your blood and sweat, built this wealth. Now that we've come, forget that you were ever here. This is our invention. This is our knowledge. I mean, I know that this is caricature. Nobody would ever treat it. When you come from a point of privilege, it's easier to minimize the suffering of the other. We as Africans have learned through many years of pain, many years of dispossession and dehumanization the following. We will never mock the people, the British people that fell in the First World War. So when the British commemorate their soldiers who died during the First World War, we don't say to them, oh, that was a long time ago. The Africans that fought in the Second World War, there's no real memorial for them. The ones who died in peacekeeping in wars, no memorial for them. The liberation icons, the villagers killed by white colonial armies, no memorial for them. They left orphans, children who had to raise themselves or who were raised by their villages. There are people who still live with trauma because colonial rule, it ended in 1990 for Namibia. Ended 6 years later for South Africa, in 1980 for Zimbabwe. It's 1975 for Mozambique. Just one last point, Americans. Can you imagine someone coming in the next 15 years and saying, 9/11, forget it. It happened too long ago. Which American? Which American? It wasn't millions of people who died at the Twin Towers. America still responds to the 1998 bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam still punishes those countries that are associated with individuals it blamed for those bombings. Nobody can come and say to the American security apparatus, American intellectual apparatus in the next 20 years, oh, it happened 50 years ago, so forget it. If you can't say that with respect to the losses of one state, one nation, one people, why is it okay to say this about the losses of Afro-descendants and Africans?
So the different kinds of experiences obviously require different kinds of recognition, different kinds of repair, right? You mentioned it can be acknowledgement, it can be restitution, it can be satisfaction, it can be memorialization, it can be addressing the lack of representation in structures of decision-making in global decision-making institutions. So it would take a range of measures. But fundamentally, I think what you are saying and suggesting is basically this is, at the end of the day, at its core, it is about affirming and recognizing the humanity and reclaiming the dignity that was attempted to be erased, that was attempted to be basically denigrated on account of the way people were treated as being less human and therefore as objects of certain activities. And therefore, at its core, it is about really making that clear. Now, if you imagine looking into the African Union theme of the year, if you imagine a successful outcome from this theme of the year, what would it look like, and where would be the policy actions need to direct themselves to, and what kind of plans and programs need to be put in place, given what you have said? What does success look like, basically?
First, a movement for reparations. That includes states, that includes citizens, that includes NGO, business people, social movements, traditional chiefs, faith leaders, and etc. A movement that actually has a people-to-people dimension with people of the Caribbean, with Afros in Brazil, in Latin America, and in Europe, Afro-descendants in Europe and in Asia. Number one, a movement, because a movement is able to build collective solidarity and collective self-defense, able to assert itself. Number two, a never again policy, a commitment by the African Union to act, to speak. The same way the African Union found the courage to speak on the war in Gaza, it must find the courage to speak on the condition and atrocities that Afro-descendants are subjected to, including their own citizens, the silence when there are atrocities happening in countries. And then they wait, and then they rush in and say, let's do transitional justice. I think that the two cannot be. Third, right? Set up a committee of experts. Don't dilly-dally by just getting lawyers. No, it's a multidisciplinary committee, anthropologists, archaeologists, historians, medical people, financial people, librarians, people who that will begin, if anything, to identify for what? For our own knowledge, collective knowledge. Before we assert it against or in claims against anyone, it's for ourselves, to know the full extent of what we're dealing with and what is possible, even if no single cent came from anyone else. Dignity is in knowing and saying to yourself, never again will we allow ourselves to be. There is a fourth element, and that fourth element is move away from this bland talk about sixth region. to actually asking yourself, do we need a commissioner for the 6th region? And a commission, do we need a process of determining and dealing officially with the 6th region, including dealing on matters of trade, on matters of investment, on matters of free movement, on matters. If we do this, we may unlock some of the technical expertise we need for our own development, some of the financial resources we need, some of the material resources we need for our own development. And we may, as Africans, also be able to contribute to some of the Afro-descendant communities in very significant ways, to build a developed Africa that's able to assert its economic, political, security, technological power globally. You can't do it in fragmented bits and pieces. You do need to build this platform. So it's not just Ghana is doing it and so on and so forth. You have to build a corridor. I'm looking for a trade platform. I'm looking for an investment platform that's as big as the AU summit, where heads of state do what they do and China calls them or Turkey calls them. They come and meet with business people from the diaspora, and they come and address certain potential for our own people to make wealth from their continent. The pathways and the channels that privilege you because you're an Afro-descendant and a member of the 6th region, and therefore, technically speaking, a citizen of this great continent and this great people, do not exist. I would say we need those, and it needs to be clearly established. And I'm also looking for these 2 pillars, transitional justice as in-facing, and reparative justice policy framework as out-facing. So I would actually develop something equivalent to the transitional justice policy framework. I wouldn't leave it to one department, because then it's made about politics, about physical violation. I think, as I've already said, reparative justice covers economy, it covers culture, it covers society at large, it covers technology, it covers security, it covers education, it covers a whole lot of things. And once we have that policy must be linked to the second decade of persons of African descent in the United Nations. And this should lead to a resolution at the UN level for rights, declaration on the rights of persons of African descent, that enables our people not to be treated like garbage in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America and elsewhere, but to be treated with dignity, that enables us to use the international judicial system to defend their rights. And I'm also envisaging, if it is successful, African universities, Caribbean universities, Latin American universities that work on or are led or have a significant population of Afro-descendant, Afro-African populations to begin structured collaborative work and exchanges on a grand scale. So this idea of Pan-African University and etc. And I'm looking to the establishment through the resources that of potential by Africans, resourced by Africans and Afro-descendant, of a Pan-African media that begins to tell our stories so that Africans are educated about the progressive contributions being made by Afro-descendants in Brazil and Colombia, being made in the Caribbean, being made in Europe, being made. We don't know each other. That's why when you're at a leadership seminar, the likelihood is that most people are going to cite or quote a Caucasian when they talk about innovation, when they talk about institution building, when they talk about leadership. And there may be nothing wrong with that in quoting and citing Asian, Caucasian, and other people. But if you don't have amongst yourself heroes, icons, and symbols, there's a reason in certain circles of politics that says identity doesn't matter, identity politics is counterproductive. Look, we were not oppressed because we were just human beings. We were oppressed particularly, and we were called names, the K word, the N word, the C word, right? When we're in Europe, where we go, we're looking for admission into those countries, we're treated in a particular way. So every day in the life of an Afro-descendant person, in the life of Muslim women, Muslim men, in the lives of traditional people who practice their tradition, your identity becomes the basis of criminalization, of exclusion, of oppression, of all sorts of dehumanization. So whilst identity is not the centerpiece of my analysis, I think that it is foolishness to say somehow we've just woken up colorblind. When I walk into a shop, I'm supposed to be a reasonably senior lawyer in certain countries in Europe. Suddenly I have too many people trying to help me. Why? Because they think I'm part of a criminal enterprise, a potential robber. When I get into some estates in Johannesburg and elsewhere that are still largely dominated by one race, when people see me walking around, taking my morning walk, they get disturbed. So in the consciousness of people raised under apartheid, in the consciousness of people raised under supremacist rule, identity has been constructed as synonymous with insecurity, as synonymous with crime, with unhygienic tendencies, as with noise, with distraction, with incompetence. And we cannot undo that by pretending it doesn't exist. How do we build a politics anchored on shared humanity, equal humanity? We don't build it through denialism. Why? Denialism only works for those who refuse to accept that there's been a significant and consistent pattern to erase the contribution of Black people, not only to civilization, to modernity, but to innovation. So no Black person in that caricature is seen. In fact, they even removed their own kings who were Black from their history books so that no one ever actually notices that they were once ruled by the Maroons in Europe.
So there is a lot of historical, intellectual, material, and of course, normative as well as financial aspects to this subject. The final thing that I would like you to speak to is basically also there are different experiences and different initiatives, how to build on them as far as the reparation theme is concerned. You made reference to, for example, the ongoing effort with respect to the genocide against the Herero in Namibia, including by the recognition of what happened by Germany itself, that it was a genocide, right? And there are also efforts, in different countries in terms of restitution, for example, of stolen objects. These are not just artifacts, but have much more deeper value and meaning for people who have been dispossessed of those things. So part of it also is, how do you factor in these initiatives and build on them in terms of the engagement for reparative justice?
The beauty of Western developmentalism and NGOization of the development sector has been this idea of thematization, segmentation, compartmentalization. The beauty of what you are asking and what you are saying in the reparations movement is intersections and interconnections. That people must realize that the return of Patrice Lumumba's tooth, right? Without asking under what circumstances did Patrice Lumumba die, and the accountability and liability and responsibility of that officer who boastfully said on behalf of their government he chopped Lumumba's body into bits and pieces, right? So those who are asking for justice for how he was killed, those who want his body parts returned as restitution, right? And those who want the memorialization of Lumumba, right, should be seen as a continuum. And those who are trying to build peace in the Congo, because instability was authored at that moment where the people's chosen choice of a leader was killed, not because the people didn't want him, but because the colonial ruler did not want any rebellious conscious native. So we now have this insecurity and make it sound as though it's a natural cultural thing for the Congolese. And yet we engineered this particular thing, right? So in a sense, these intersections that you describe, these are intersections that require us to be truly interdisciplinary in our approach. So there's the organizing by the states, African states, organizing by African regional economic communities, but organizing must also happen amongst and by African media, amongst by African intellectuals, amongst by African social justice actors. And we must reach out across the aisle to each other. The idea that this is a project that can be won in one day, which is the psychotic condition, neurotic condition that the NGO sector and others in development have gotten into, must be disabused. The struggle for reparations will go on for generations to come. Those of us who are part of it now must realize MK Abiola from Nigeria and others who were really at the forefront of this in the 90s and in the 80s are not here anymore, but they left us documentation, they left us evidence. So I'm suggesting, Dr. Deso, that, you see, my brother Solomon, that the churches have a role here. The Church of England apologized for its role in enslavement. The Catholic Church, the Pope apologized. They offered some token amounts. So there is the spiritual movements. Some people may wish to know that the first resistance, the first attempt at reparative politics actually happened in a movement which was called the Abyssinian movement, the indigenous traditional African church movements in the 1870s and 1880s. It preceded the Pan-African movement, and it used religion as the center of critique of the dehumanization. So let me just make a gratuitous comment here. It viewed those who transacted violence as the inhuman, and those who were the recipients of the violence as the humans, right? And the attempt by the inhuman, because being brutal in faith was viewed as being inhuman, as lacking the heart of a believer, lacking the heart of love, of empathy. So anybody who would chop another person's limb was always seen as the inhuman one. So the rehumanization process in both transitional justice and reparative justice, a rehumanization of the perpetrator and a rehumanization of the survivor or the victim. So this conversation is not about hatred of white folk. This conversation is not about vengeance against white folks. This conversation is not a racist fixation with they and us. This conversation is about self, right? That I am as I think, right? And I know that I am fully human. But because you took away the things I need for sustainable living and livelihood, for sustainably developing without depending on you, I'm asking you, right? You took it unjustly, return it. You did it unjustly, acknowledge it, right? So, you know, the conversation has a higher moral, higher political, a higher ideological, a higher technical conversation that you now develop technology that uses Black folk as guinea pigs for your experiment. So if we're talking about, well, you do HIV and AIDS, how? You do Ebola, how? It's not about conspiracy theories. It's recognizing that global pharmaceutical companies also now use Black lives as guinea pigs for some of the most moribund experimentations. The forced sterilization of women in Kenya for some development, and in parts of Africa under the guise of doing sickle sickness treatment or malaria or something. When you open the box of reparations, you are not opening a quick fix. a government political campaign slogan or a quick fix NGO quick project. You're opening a painful and promising conversation. Promising why? It's not just about memory, because memory is about the pain. It's about imagination. Because the imagination is about how do we build a world where we don't have to treat each other like animals. We don't have to be cruel to each other. Imagination is about how do we build technology? How do we build medicine? How do we build food production system? How do we build wealth creation systems that don't depend on dehumanization of people based on their identity? How do we build it in ways that don't justify the poisoning of my soil, my home, my village, so that you can live in comfort 1,000 kilometers away? How do we actually take that principle that's accepted elsewhere in the West, the polluter pays, and understand that it is a statement of repair, right? If there's an oil spill by BP in America, BP pays several million to make good the oil spill. If there's an oil spill in Ogoniland by Shell or somebody else, nobody pays, because it's assumed our lives are not fully human. So it's not just about memory. It's not just about imagination. It's about the existential crisis of humanity. Let me end with this, Solomon. The Afro descendants and African people are going to be the majority of the world. Whether we like it or not, we have the fastest growing populations, the most youthful populations, and we're becoming dominant in technology. So unless our leaders actually conspire with those that fear our people and to kill off the race, right? What's going to happen is, if the Black folk and Afro descendants are, as projected by New York Times and others, going to be the majority of the world in the next couple of years, how would you like them to treat you? In what ways have you treated them that will determine justifications in their heads of how you treat other human beings that are different? That question should make people understand, do repair now, so that in future we can restrain the propensity of any majority to behave in an inhumane way towards minorities.
This conversation can continue for the next hour or two, but we have to end it.
Thank you.
End it on that very affirmative note, that this is not about holding anything against anybody. This is also not just about affirming the humanity and the dignity of those who have been wronged as a result of those historical events. This is also about establishing that condition where the humanity of the wrongdoers is also reestablished. This is really a very fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Brian, for making time to sit down with us, Amani-Africa's podcast, the Pan-Africanist. We do hope that this conversation helps clarify some of the conceptual, legal, and intellectual issues that surround the African Union theme of the year on reparations for Africans and people of African descent. Thank you very much once again.
Marita, thank you so much. All the best.
You're listening to the Pan-Africanist, Amani-Africa's podcast. Thank you for joining. To find out more on Amani-Africa's work, please check our website, amaniafrica-et.org.